Welcome to Whakaoreore, our mobilising workshop. I am proud to present to you my fellow panellists for this afternoon. This session is an engaging session, so there will be opportunities actually for you to ask any questions that might be top of mind for you. Feel free to do so. I don't even know if I introduced myself, but ko Nancy Twaini ahau. He mokopuna o te awa o Whanganui, engari he kaimahi mō te puni kōkiri. So I'll start off with our panellists introducing themselves. Ai.
Tēnā tātou, ko Whakaoreore tōku ingoa, ko Ngāti Mutunga o Whakaoreore, ko Ngai Tahu o Kuiwi, and I'm a Deputy Chief Executive at Te Puni Kōkiri and Regional Partnerships. Previous life working in iwi, community and education. Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Jeff Short. I'm the Executive Director at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet that looks after child wellbeing and child poverty work. And in my previous life I worked with Dai and Hirawini. Previous life, my life of sins, I worked with Dai and Hirawini. So it's great to be here.
E tēnā koutou, e ngā mata o tēnā tari, o tēnā hāpuri, o tēnā iwi. Whakarau ka mai i tēnei rā. Ko Hirawini te koha ahau, hei kai whakahaere o te runanga nui o Ngāti Porou, and I was also blessed in a previous life. Not so much blessed by Jeffrey Short, but blessed by Dai Grenell. So I don't know, happy to be here. We're about as good as the questions we get, so ask good questions and we won't bore you. Kia ora.
I'm going to ask the first question and then get them to talk a little bit about, from this perspective, what are the key things you've seen make collaboration in the interests of mobilising Whānau successful?
Kia ora tātou. I get to start and I'm sitting down. I think we've been comparing bad backs and all those other things that come to us as we get more mature. So I'm going to stay sitting down. I thought I'd start with two examples, seeing we're after lunch, and then just look really quickly at what the success features were. One was in my pre-government life. Anyone remember the repeal of Section 59? Yes. Okay, ka pai, Helen Leahy. Why am I not surprised? So at that time I was working for the 7 iwi in Taitokerau, and those of us who were the kaimai determined it would be awesome if the 7 iwi could put in a joint submission to support the repeal. Aue marika, what an exercise in collaboration. So 7 runanga involved, one had 22 trustees, and they all had to agree before we could come together and put a position to government led by Whānau Glavish. The runanga I worked for, the kuia that put it to the table, voted against it the first time round, even though she was the one putting the motion on the floor. And I didn't think that we would get there, but we did, and it was one of my proudest moments to see Whānau stand and have the 7 iwi there to talk to the select committee. So what worked? I think we went for the highest value, and we could agree in terms of our tamariki. So that was the highest value. We had some great leadership. So we did have people like Whānau who were prepared to take on and challenge others who had differing views. We also had, and I'd like to think we could take a little bit of credit from the kaimahi end, some really nuanced communications for the different audiences that we needed to bring on board. So some people needed a policy position paper before they could be convinced. Others needed to hear a story from someone like Nada. Some needed messages that they could give so that they could talk to the people that they were trying to get to vote to support the position. So nuanced communications were really, really important. And then we had to put some resources close to where the people were. It was no good having all the resources sitting in the office. The resource, the communication resource, the messaging needed to actually be out where people were doing their voting and iwi land. So that was one example. The other one, really quickly, in my current life, housing. Post the Edgecombe floods, we engaged in a partnership with MB, with a building company, with a marae committee, with an ahuwhenua trust, with a builder, with local government to get some emergency transitional housing in place for Whānau who'd been affected by the Edgecombe flooding. And we could only get 2 government agencies of the 3 that needed to be over the line. One didn't have a permission environment that allowed them to sign up. So it took some flexibility, it took a bit of bravery, because I had to be the first autograph to cross the line and say we'd put the money in. And we were the smallest agency. But without us crossing the line, then the second agency wouldn't have crossed the line. And the third agency, 18 months later, wouldn't have come in and put their money in to support the sustainability of the project. So that also meant we needed to create a space for new partners. Because at that point, we could have gotten all righteous and said, oh, well, you fellas didn't sign up in the first place, and it's our name and our agency logo that we want to have outside the gate, not yours. But for the well-being of the people and the whānau, we had to make a call to create pathways for new people to come in, and that's critical in collaboration as well. Overarching message, right engagement at the right level with the right people and the right message. Kia ora. This is what it was like working with them too, yeah. Not a lot's changed. Just get the sound working. Ka pai.
So, does that work? Oh yeah, good, okay. Probably from my experience, one of the things that's really important is to think through purpose. You know, what are we collaborating for? What are we mobilising people to do? And actually spend quite a lot of time on that purpose, because it shifts. It doesn't stay static, and if you can spend time really unpacking it with people, then you have much longer, your pathway into change is much longer. There's nothing sort of that becomes more frustrating than the goalposts move shortly after you've worked out which field you're on. And in my experience in collaborative ventures, that can occur quite a bit, and you realise that what you had originally packed in to do is now quite a different exercise, and one that you might be quite ill prepared for, or you might be too prepared for. So really kind of spending time unpacking the purpose of working together and why you're looking to do activity to mobilise whānau is quite important. That takes resource, and too often we'll do things from the government end where that resource is not made available, and in fact you're trying to think through your purpose and work out how you can collaborate together at a time when you're busy actually delivering, and so that can be quite challenging. So for government agencies, it's important when we're thinking about integrated approaches to things that we also work through what we need to do to provide organisations we're working with the resources so they can have the capacity to work through things. Sometimes we've been good at that, sometimes not so much. A good example of it, when we were doing Whānau at the start, we were thinking about making resources available for programs of action, so that people actually spent time through their providers planning the change that they wanted to see, engaging with their whānau to test out whether that was the change that whānau were looking for from them, and actually to get that step change requires quite a number of sometimes quite small steps. Certainly I noticed that amongst providers sitting around the table, many of them had not had the opportunity to disclose to each other the services that they were offering. So what seemed, or might seem now to be somewhat small, actually was quite a big deal for people to work through, particularly where there were providers who were opting to work together that might be 5 kilometres apart, but not having got in the room with each other for 25 years to talk about their services. So actually just coming together was a really big deal, and needed time to percolate across them. So sometimes our push and our resourcing doesn't match what's needed to shift things. Probably my key learning across a range of fronts has been about where you hardwire things into the system and where you need soft wiring approaches, and actually sometimes that's a balance. So we will often build boards, joint ventures, different kind of institutional arrangements, but we won't spend time practicing or developing the relational skills that are needed to operate those things. Too often, whoever holds the pen holds the power, sets the agenda, and everybody else falls into line with them. It's quite a unique set of skills that's needed. Sometimes it's quite different from the skills you have available to you to work through how to work as a group. You know, if we look at our own schools, some of our most outstanding individual students are not very good at group work. So we just need to think about how we provide for that. And too often we will have groups where the leadership is there, the organisation has found a common purpose with others, and everybody's working hard, but the hard wiring over the arrangement, the oversight, the governance, the ownership, the sharing of stuff in a more formal way isn't there to support those efforts and needs to be more developed. So hard wiring and soft wiring is actually quite an important bit to think through in undertaking collaboration.
There are people in this room who have asked me for my advice and view periodically. There's also at least one person in this room who's come to my district to kick my backside for not collaborating properly. So we're all across the spectrum on all of this. What I'll say to get things going anyway, three things. Firstly, Whānau are mobilising all the time. They just might not be mobilising for you. So how do you get to that place where there's value seen by all of the potential partners in the cause or the kaupapa, and finding all of those other conditions for success, or helping to create all of those other conditions for success, specifically leadership, the right kind of leadership to galvanise effort, to open minds, and where warranted, in the absence of good metrics or data, create enough goodwill and faith to step towards a shared proposition. Secondly, pai te kōrero ka noho tahi te tuakana me te taina I roto i te whakaaro kotai. I love that saying. I love that saying which harks to mahi tahi. That we have potentially, almost inevitably, the forming up of ventures between parties of unequal influence, unequal resources, means, or whatever it is, but are brought together to realise a shared kaupapa. Because not all, most partnerships are not created equally. Ask any Ngāti Pro man who's married a Ngāti Pro woman. No Ngāti Pro men here, I see. Whānau. It's not about whether or not we are 50-50 partners straight down the line. If the kaupapa is compelling enough, we find ways for these exercises, these partnerships to form up and to be effective for all concerned. I get to live a wonderful work and personal life in my part of the world, in Tairāwhiti. And this sheets home the challenge of not just good communication or good communication systems, but to be constantly working at that communication. One of the roles I carry in a personal capacity is as a trustee of two land blocks, multiply owned Māori land blocks, one with 2,500 very small shareholders. And we found ourselves having a discussion about the trustees. We're a partnership, so we've got 3 farms that have come together as a limited partnership, and we were talking about doing repairs to the farm manager's house. And quite by surprise, I'm a fairly recent member to the Trust, last 12 months only. This was a red rag issue to one of my fellow trustees who just went off about finding more money, yet more money for the farm manager's house, and being so over it. And why don't we talk about repairs and maintenance for all of the properties, not just the farm manager's house? And I was sitting there thinking, this surely can't be about what it's about. What else is going on here? And as it transpires, this has been a long-running battle. So even though we know attracting a good farm manager and their family, farming couple and young kids is in part reliant on having a decent home for the farm manager and the family to live in, this became a deal-breaking issue for one of my cousins on the Trust. So you pick a little bit more and you find out that the farmhouse in question, the property in question, is on the balance sheet of just one partner, not both partners. And for all of these years, the other partner's been feeling aggrieved about all of this capital commitment that's gone into a house that's not on their part of the balance sheet. It wasn't about what the farm manager's needs were or the logic of having a decent house for the farm manager. It was about the taina partner feeling like they were getting the raw end of the stick. And so when we think we've gotten to a good place in terms of everybody having shared sense of purpose, all of that sort of stuff, we also have to realise that keeping that whole proposition afloat is a ia ata, ia pō, ia rā, ia wiki, ia marama, ia tau proposition. Do not take this stuff for granted. We have to work at it constantly, or we'll find, without even realising it, that the things that bring people together, once they become neglected, tend to see us drift apart. Whānau, koina tāku.
These guys have gotten hotter as the day's gone on. And Hirawini raises a good example of getting underneath, understanding the context, which is what Irina spoke about this morning. When you're going into a community, what's the context for the people that you're about to interact with? Anyway, now's an opportunity, after hearing from each of them, for you to ask any questions of what they've just talked about before we lead into the next kōrero. Questions from the floor. Come on, mobilise. Anything in the back of your pocket that you want to bring forward?
Or else I'm just going to start giving answers to questions you haven't asked.
So collaboration requires buy-in from parties. How do you ensure collaboration across staff turnover within an agency? How do you ensure that collaborative mindset continues? And lastly, what strategies would you have when you're going out to a community who have to relegate to tell their story over and over again as people turn over to minimise that fallout? Yes.
I'll have first crack at that one. Sometimes you have to ask yourself whether or not, agency-wise, whatever agencies we all belong to, you belong to, are we the best stewards of this particular matter? Because if we operate in an environment which is fraught with staff turnover, fraught with the risks of eroding institutional memory or continuity, then you really have to ask yourself what you're doing, why you're doing what you're doing, or why you think you're best placed to be managing that set of circumstances for the relationship. So what you talk about is a real-life example that those of us in the iwi or community or NGO sector, it's hard to grin and bear that sort of carry-on, where you kind of, talking to, what's that, Dory from the fish cartoon, where you're kind of constantly having to reset, like, this is where we came from, and this is the whakapapa of this thing, and last time we met with your predecessor, these were what we set out to do with each other. So I'd just kind of challenge agencies that are in that situation, rather than, oh shucks, what we can do about it. Think about how much more of that kind of inter-agency or partnership institutional stuff necessarily has to reside within your four walls, and what can be vested in the partner that brings continuity to that arrangement as much as possible. And if solving your staff turnover is to take our staff, then I'd rather you have staff turnover. You're too expensive to compete with. Kia ora.
Kia ora, H. Answer from a slightly different perspective, but not one that disagrees. My first view is someone who's Wellington-based but has only lived and worked in Wellington since 2010, and before that never lived or worked in Wellington, is build your networks and trust the regional staff that you have that are close to the people and often have less turnover. So don't be the Wellington person who's got to go out and ask the questions directly of the person and then not believe that it's true unless you saw them. So your regional staff, the providers that you have and others can be a really good proxy for a direct engagement with that community, and you should make sure that you've got people that you can reference without having to send every new Wellington person out to start the story all over again so they can believe it for themselves. Otherwise, it does drive people porangi to have to answer the same questions over and over and over again. And often we're asking people to tell a negative story to prove that they're deserving of resourcing. And I think that's a really uncomfortable thing to do and to ask of people. So I don't think that we should put people in that position. We should use the existing data sources that we've got and build those, and then we can work with others who have been closer to the scene and deal with the information that they've got. And finally, what's the purpose? It's unfortunate, but often we have people who like to be seen to be the operation rescue when the big issue comes on. But who were the kanohi kitea walking alongside the community the rest of the time?
Two things. First is today is the 16th anniversary of the first Whānau Development Summit. It took place in Otaki on the 24th and 25th of March. I'm not sure we all knew that, but that is as it is. So even us holding institutional knowledge over time across agencies and in the community can be quite tricky to achieve too. We move on so quickly that we forget our history along the way, and that can be a challenge. But there is some benefit in that. One of the things I've noticed today is I can't really kind of say this, but it's the challenge from the millennials, right? We've all sort of worked, as many here have, in government agencies or in around the system stuff, and we've pushed things to a new plateau, as it might be. We've created a new foundation, and one of the things I've noticed is younger people coming in who don't accept that as the status quo and push on beyond it. The challenge for us is to help them to see where the things they're pushing for are quite orthodox, and where what they're pushing for is incredibly innovative. Because they don't have the reference points that we might have had kind of coming through the system a bit more. So turnover can be quite healthy in that regard, I think, but it's how to keep the story alive, sometimes over quite a long period of time now.
I think Jeff raises a really good point. 50% of our people are under the age of 25. So, if we're future focused, we're actually looking to that age group to think about what are we planning for into the future. Not necessarily people our age, or they might be older than me, but we're looking at the next generation to design some of that stuff and to make sure that we are thinking about what's relevant to them, because it's not necessarily where we're at. Ka pai? Okay, so this is about also drawing from you. If you have an example of a piece of work that you are currently working on that is looking to collaborate all the co's we've talked about over time this morning, co-design, co-everything. If you've got a piece of work that you're working on in your workplace at this time, that you wouldn't mind testing with these guys about what they could do to support you with some tools and strategies in that kaupapa. Any kaupapa, live kaupapa on the floor that you want to exchange in a conversation with these guys? Have a go. Go for it, James.
So I'm James. I work for one of the bigger government departments, and we're obviously really keen to get good at this kind of stuff. But the trouble with big government departments is that our contribution always comes with a lot of strings attached. If it's our money, we want services or specific outcomes that are different to everybody else's outcomes. Or if it's governance and leadership, we want to manage the likelihood of risk and make things a bit more structured. So if you've got any thoughts, advice on how we can cut some of those strings to get to your answers?
Yeah, endo.
Kōrero.
Am I that one? Is that dated language?
Kōrero tōne.
Well,
Oh,
break
look,
it down, brother.
Yeah.
Big departments, yes. Mode more of your baseline to be about resourcing at the community level. So one of the great things about tēnā koe merepeka, me tō tima, koutou ngā kumihana a whānau ora katoa, tēnā koutou. Whānau has a small Poutū relative to all these other big baselines and big agencies, but it has the chiefly attribute of being agile, non-prescribed resourcing. And I would take $1 of flexible funding over $10 of big departmental funding any day of the week, because all government money is expensive, but then there's just inordinately expensive money. And that normally comes in the form of pre-chewed KPIs, service specs, and all that other sort of stuff. And you'll find a sentiment within the community and the iwi sector I can speak to with utmost confidence, where we're kind of over it. The prospect of being price takers and delivering somebody else's heavily prescribed service spec is not anything that particularly fascinates us or enamors us or gets my kaimahi out of bed in the morning. So there are some challenges for these big sector agencies, but again, to be an effective fleet, we can't all be PT boats roaming around knocking into each other, and we can't all be aircraft carriers, but we need the right balance of each, and to acknowledge our strengths and limitations and partner with those, the tuakana and taina kōrero, partner with those who grow the size of the pie beyond the sum of the parts. So to big sector agencies, look, and I'll risk going down another alley here when I close out my response to you all. Whoever came up with that term and concept of risk management in the public sector set us back fundamentally 15 to 20 years in terms of scope to collaborate with courage on behalf of our whānau and communities, because by time well-meaning public sector leaders have done all of their de-risking and de-risking and de-risking, what gets spat out at the other end is so prescribed, so narrowly focused, so lacking in context that you're not really looking for partners, you're looking for automatons delivering widgets come hell or high weather. And I think we're doing our communities and families a huge disservice wherever we are in that continuum by our failure to challenge that orthodoxy.
Can I add something here, please? Would you mind, Henry? Would you mind?
Oh.
Just, I'd like to respond to you, and pure for saying that as a big government agency, you have some issues, obviously. And can I just say that...
That's not what James meant, but yeah.
Your time has come.
Not you.
Your time has come, and it's the fearless leadership of some of us who work, as you say, in the commissioning agencies, who will be holding government departments and
Kia ora, Merepeka. I'll just add something that I referenced this morning as well, and some of you have been veterans of all sorts of initiatives to try and streamline. Integrated contracting was one of those, at the time. And I can remember sitting in a room full of people, I won't say which agency, but it wasn't mine, where they went around the room and talked about how the progress with integrated contracting was going. And it was incredible. One leader said, "Oh no, it's illegal, so we're not doing that." The person next to them said, "We did that last week." Somebody else said, "We've talked about it, but we just don't like it." And so as we moved around the room, we had this incredibly varied response, and it really came down to can't, won't, and don't. And Jeff's touched in a previous session on, some of the things that sit within current legislation, Public Finance Act, etc., state services legislation. And there are some things that put us in the can't space, but often we're operating from don't and won't. And we've got to be quite courageous with ourselves and challenge ourselves. Talk to our legal, talk to our procurement, push underneath and find out what's really going on. Is it really we can't because we'd be breaching the Public Finance Act? Or because the way that we've decided to de-risk ourselves is that we've put 5 more layers on top of that requirement in order to stay safe. And I think that's a bit of a sobering conversation sometimes for us to have, and to look in the mirror and be really clear about which of those zones that we're in, and to make allies actually of our finance and legal and procurement teams, because often we have a great policy idea, we get the community excited, and then we come back and we kill it with the 57-page relationship agreement. And at round about then, people are no longer interested. So, yeah, he whakaaro.
Just probably my 2 cents worth is, this is really quite hard to do. It's really quite hard for large agencies to turn their heads. They take quite a bit of work to reorganise and reorient the way that they work. It's quite, can be quite tricky, and it requires quite a lot of leadership to achieve that. One of the ways that works best is competition. That there's someone else who can do some of these things that they might not be able to do. And so it's neat that we're sort of having a conversation in a zone where there's potential other competition for how government monies can be invested into people's lives that join them up to a greater degree. And that is quite a movement over the last decade to starting to see some of those collaborative ventures now kind of start to compete into the big people zone, as it were. And so my mihi actually is to TPK, who has fostered, supported some of this stuff for, several decades now, whether that was kohanga coming out of the garage or, now Whānau coming out bigger. It's often gets a lot of criticism for not being able to show some great policy journey on things, but the fact that a number of these newer, more focused, challenging and competing initiatives have come out of TPK is a good thing, and deserves a bit of praise for that.
Kia ora, Jeff. I think, one of the reasons why we brought everybody together today is because we only do have $1. In the scheme of things across government, our Whānau investment is roughly around $73 million. It's pretty pitiful in terms of the impact that we're seeking to change over in our communities. So today was about trying to draw some partners in, either to come and have a conversation with us or to come and have a conversation with some of our other partners that are here and who will speak shortly. Anyway, before I get carried away with myself, any other pātai from the floor that draws on our conversation a little bit more?
Can I kill it, Chair?
Kia ora, Chad.
Get a Chad.
There's been a shift in thinking, a strengthening in the thinking around orientation to whānau. And so, the coming into being of the whānau or the commissioning agencies and things like that is a sort of step forward in that. But so much of the public sector orientation is still around the individual. So we can push within each of the agencies to change that and to strive for a recognition and the validity of recognition of measurement against whānau and whānau progress, not as a displacement of, but as something that runs legitimately in parallel. But it seems like that's a long, slow way to do this, which is to kind of go one agency by one agency by one agency. Where's the bigger push going to come from to kind of get the big shift happening on this? I mean, look, and I'm not saying that you guys have got all the answers, but I'm just kind of curious because unless that happens, we're going to be sitting here in another 20 years saying, well done to that agency over there and this small one over here and that one there who had bold leadership. The rest of it is still counting individual widgets. So if we're kind of serious about a shift to a whānau orientation, those hooks right at ministerial and cabinet kind of level have to be cemented there to allow the bottoms and the bureaucrats and stuff like that to kind of make it happen. How does that big shift happen?
Looking,
Maybe that's a question for the wider floor as well, but I'm curious what you guys know.
We're going to answer that in our session.
just
Chad,
find that
just
picture.
again, my sort of 2.5 cents maybe. I think there's a view that it's one or the other, or it turns around on a dime. It doesn't. In my experience, I've had stuff where I've had what we call cabinet greens. I've had cabinet minutes where we had done some reasonably innovative, edgy, risky stuff. Just looking around the room to see if there's anyone in here. We did some stuff and we went to cabinet and it was, ministers liked it, they wanted to see more of it, right? So we had cabinet minutes that were directing other agencies to actually sustainably fund some of the things that we had put money into and help to get off the ground. On the ground ideas, we just kind of backed them. Despite those cabinet minutes, they didn't get funded. They didn't get lifted up. They didn't get turned into contracts. There is some stuff this year. We will see the State Sector Act be reformed. We will see the Public Finance Act get turned around. They are the big levers that will pull all of the public service machinery around. But it will take time for that flotilla to sort of shift and the big tankers take longer to shift. So I've not really seen where an aha moment's gone, Cabinet said, we're going down this pathway now, and it instantly transfers into something. What I've generally seen is Cabinet's push for some change, sometimes with the support of the bureaucracy, sometimes without it, sometimes without the public tolerance needed to really make it go quickly, and sometimes they're the last ones when the public service and the public have decided to shift things in a particular direction, and Cabinet's the last ones to come to that party. I think it is a bit more evolutionary than revolutionary. There is some stuff going on that I think we'll all be proud of, but it will take time to sort of come through the system and for it to orient itself differently. And
I guess that's the thing, Steve, and you will know better than most about how the difficulty in that machinery. I guess my frustration is it's the time thing. Like there's a much all been in the health sector and all this sort of things. And we talked about the journey that we started way back in the RHA days around Māori health provision and fostering Māori health providers and stuff like that, working with the mainstream institutions to kind of lift the knowledge about competency, safety, you name the words. Here we are, like 25 years later, in institutions saying we need to have a cultural development and training program in this agency. Frick, 20 years later, staff changed, so we're back at the beginning. And what's changed? So I get that there is a slowness, and I get that there is a juggernaut, and it's got lots of gears and legs and cogs, but that can't be the answer.
No, and I'm not excusing it. Basically, I'm not excusing it. It's just I've just been around at the end of last year talking to people about a child and youth wellbeing strategy. You know, let's have something focused on our kids that sit in the context of their whānau and reorient quite large amounts of government focus onto the place where it should be, which should be our kids, not necessarily our economy, although they're kind of interlinked. And what struck me going around talking to people was how little progress we'd made in a decade or more. That actually, I distinctly remember going to Te Puia Marae was a really good example where the āhua of the marae had not, it felt, grown much in that decade since when I'd been there last. And despite the fact they were now in effect providing social housing and social services through the marae, it didn't look like that puna of well-being that it had looked like before. So I was quite struck going around the country at how far we hadn't made progress over quite a period of time now. And that's something that public servants feel deeply about, because that's your stewardship obligation. That irrespective of the coming or going of a government, you've got an obligation to continue to improve things. So it was quite humbling to go around and see that actually, despite all sorts of things having been done over the years, it didn't feel like the difference was being made to the outcomes that we have been pursuing. And all you can do is kind of double down your efforts to see change come through. Doesn't excuse it, but it explains it, possibly.
Is it a recognition that the juggernaut is a juggernaut, it's always going to be a juggernaut, and stuff that you spend some resource on the juggernaut, but actually you look into the disruptive space and just say, we just go down a different path?
Aye. Tika tau. I mean, there's a saying by somebody clever, and the revolution will not be funded. And so I think of, you know, in its inherent state, the state has some confinements that allow it to continue to perpetuate itself. And having sat in a few variations of state effort to change, as soon as you start to get towards the edge of a boundary that threatens the status quo, then the system corrects lest it really turn itself on its head. And we're not good at turning things off either. And so when we do have the new idea that's going to change and revolutionise potentially from within government, the way government's organised, we don't want to let anything else go because some people will be upset. And not just people in government, but it means radical changes, as you know, to things like funding and the way that we organise. Impact, they have real impacts. Real people can lose jobs. Real community organisations who contribute to the social capital of small communities can lose funding when we try to reorganise things. So there's a lot of collateral damage sometimes. So it doesn't just require some sort of abstract bravery in Wellington. It requires some real end-to-end thinking about who's going to be impacted on here if we turn the whole system on its head. So when you use the word disruptive, I think, yes, many of the big changes that we've seen socially over the years haven't come out of changes to the way that government's organised itself and the wiring diagram. They've actually come out of social movements that have had an impact, shaken everybody, and government has then had to reset almost in response to that. Now, how much of that we can tolerate, because you can't tolerate that as a constant, is also an issue. But yeah, we're really picking into theory of change and social change now, and I don't think that we certainly haven't cracked it, and I don't know that government's going to be the place to find that answer.
No.
Yeah, I agree with that, all of that, but the last point particularly. That 20-year plus time frame you talk about, Chad, we add another 5 or 10 to that. I'll only talk to the iwi context here. There's many other communities of interest here. But we've had a lot of our people capital tied up in the Treaty of Waitangi claims and settlements process. That people capital is being released now more and more to front foot kaupapa within our communities. So I recognise and support all of those within the public sector who are working with heart, conscience and good data to try and move the boundaries within sectors or within systems. But there needs to be an articulate demand-side voice to this as well. And the challenge for iwi authorities, for the big NGOs, the whole tuakana taina side, is to have clear expectations of the system, a clear sense of what's permissible activity and results as opposed to same old, and to be a fearless champion for that sort of stuff, because we can't expect public sector leadership to grow the scope of what's possible if the rest of us are wahangū on the outside, not giving any soundings, any feedback, any demands as to what constitutes the public good and good public service to, well, people who look like me from my part of the world. So we've got local police who are, you know, hats off to them. They're very transparent. So in the Eastern District, the policing area where I work and I'm from, for Māori apprehended by our local police, viz New Zealand Pākehā apprehended, where the same criteria exist. Favourable discretions are being exercised by local police at about 3 times the rate of for Pākehā New Zealanders in Tairāwhiti than for people who look like me. And perversely, the rates of complaints made against Eastern District Police are twice as high for New Zealand Pākehā than they are for New Zealand Māori. So we're getting the rough end of the discretion and we're complaining less about it. We've got to turn those metrics, those of us who have platforms to advocate for what's right in our communities, we've got to put a spotlight on this stuff so that those who are trying to build the internal pressure systems within sectors have actually something to hang their hats on.
I'm fine. Sorry, we're running out of time. So we need to get our room ready for our next lot of keynote deliveries, and the people are going to come back into our room. That's been a real robust exchange. Don't forget, on your app you can send messages or pārtai to any one of these by having a look in your attendees list. If you've got something that you have a question that you still want to explore with them, please send them a message via the app and get them to have an exchange with you on that. Before the multitudes of people come stampeding back into our hall today, I just want to take the opportunity to ask you to give a round of applause to our panellists. Yes.